1 year in, here are 20 broken promises to you Trump voters. Number one, he told you he'd cut your taxes and that the super rich like him would pay more.
I think there's very little benefit for people of wealth.
You bought it. But his new tax law does the opposite. By 2027, according to the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center, the richest 1% will have got 83% of the tax cut, and the richest 1/10 of 1%, 60% of it. But more than half of all Americans, 53%, will pay more in taxes. As Trump told his wealthy friends at Mar-a-Lago just days after the tax bill became law, you all just got a lot richer. Number two, he promised to close
special interest loopholes that have been so good for Wall Street investors, but unfair to American workers.
Especially the notorious carried interest loophole for private equity, hedge fund, and real estate partners. You bought it. But the new tax law keeps the carried interest loophole. Number three, he told you he'd repeal Obamacare and replace it with something
Beautiful.
You bought it. But he didn't repeal, and he didn't replace. Just as well, his plan would have knocked at least 23 million Americans off health insurance, including many of you. Instead, he's doing what he can to cut it back and replace it with nothing. The new tax law will result in 13 million people losing health coverage, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Number four, he told you he'd invest $1 trillion in our nation's crumbling infrastructure. You bought it. But after his giant tax cut for corporations and millionaires, there's no money left for infrastructure. Number five, he said he'd drain the Washington swamp.
We are going to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
You bought it. But he's brought into his administration more billionaires, CEOs, and Wall Street moguls than in any administration in history to make laws that will enrich their businesses. And he's filled departments and agencies with former lobbyists, lawyers, and consultants who are crafting new policies for the same industries they recently worked for. Number six, he said he'd use his business experience to whip the White House into shape. You bought it. But he has created the most dysfunctional, backstabbing White House in modern history and has already fired and replaced so many assistants, one of them hired and fired in a little more than a week, that people there barely know who's in charge of what. Number seven, he told you he'd bring down drug prices.
We are going to get drug prices, prescription drug prices, way down.
By making deals with drug companies. You bought it. But now the White House says that promise is inoperative. Number eight, he promised a complete ban on foreign lobbyists raising money for American elections. You bought it. But foreign lobbyists are still raising money for American elections. Number nine, he told you,
I'm not going to cut Social Security like every other Republican, and I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid.
You bought it. But he and House Speaker Paul Ryan are already planning such cuts in order to deal with a ballooning deficit created in part by the new tax law for corporations and the rich. Number 10, he promised 6 weeks of paid maternity leave to any mother with a newborn child whose employer does not provide the benefit.
We can provide 6 weeks of paid maternity leave to any mother with a newborn child whose employer does not provide the benefit.
You bought it, but the giant tax cut for corporations and the rich doesn't leave any money for this. Number 11, he said that on day one,
We are going to label China a currency manipulator.
You bought it. But then he met with China's President Xi Jinping and declared China is not a currency manipulator. Ever since then, Trump has been cozying up to Xi. Number 12, he said he wouldn't bomb Syria. You bought it. Then he bombed Syria. Number 13, he said he'd build a wall across the southern border. You believed him. But Chief of Staff John Kelly says it's unlikely that we will build a wall, a physical barrier, from sea to shining sea. Number 14, he promised that the many women who accused him of sexual misconduct will be sued after the election is over.
All of these liars will be sued after the election is over.
You bought it. He hasn't sued them, presumably because he doesn't want the truth to come out. Number 15, he said he would not be a president who took vacations.
I promise you, I will not be taking very long vacations if I take them at all. There's no time for vacation.
And he called Barack Obama the vacationer in chief. You bought it. But since becoming president, he has spent nearly 25% of his days at one of his golf properties for some portion of the day, according to Golf News Network, at a cost to taxpayers of over $77 million. That's already more taxpayer money on vacations than Obama cost in the first 3 years of his presidency. Not to mention all the money taxpayers are spending protecting his family, including his 2 sons who travel all over the world on Trump business. Number 16, he said he'd force companies to keep jobs in America and that there would be consequences for companies that shipped jobs abroad.
Companies are not going to leave the United States anymore without consequences. Not going to happen.
But you believed him. But despite their promises, Carrier, Ford, GM, and the rest have continued to ship jobs to Mexico and China. Carrier, a division of United Technologies, has moved ahead with plans to send 1,000 jobs at its Indiana plant to Mexico. Notwithstanding, the federal government has rewarded United Technologies with 15 new contracts since Trump's inauguration. GE is sending jobs to Canada, IBM is sending them to Costa Rica, Egypt, Argentina, and Brazil. There have been no consequences for sending all these jobs overseas. Number 17, he promised to revive the struggling coal industry and bring back thousands of lost coal mining jobs. You bought it. But coal jobs continue to disappear. Since Trump's victory, at least 6 plants that relied on coal have closed or announced they will close. Another 40 are projected to close during the president's 4-year term. Utilities continue to switch to natural gas instead of coal, and renewable energy is cheaper than ever. Number 18, he promised to protect steel workers.
We will put new American steel into the spine of our country.
But according to the American Iron and Steel Institute, which tracks shipments, steel imports were 19.4% higher in the first 10 months of 2017 than in the same period the year before. That import surge has hurt American steelworkers, who are already struggling against a glut of cheap Chinese steel. Number 19, he said he'd make America safer. You believed him. But according to Mass Shooting Tracker, there were 427 mass shootings in 2017, including 58 people killed and hundreds injured at a concert in Las Vegas, and 26 churchgoers killed and 20 injured at a church in Texas. Trump refuses to consider any gun control legislation. Number 20, he said he'd release his taxes.
I'm under a routine audit, and it'll be released, and as soon as the audit's finished, it'll be released.
He said during the campaign. He hasn't released his taxes.